Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm Tom Powers, the documentary programmer for the Toronto International Film Festival and artistic director of Doc NYC. On this episode, we hear a conversation I led at the Doc NYC Festival in November. The topic was Finding the Style for the Story, with filmmakers Ceyda Torun, Morgen, and Errol Morris.
There's a line I like very much from Philip Glass. I'm always thinking about it. He said they can always copy what you've done, but they can never copy what you're going to do.
Each of these directors have recent films that you wouldn't mistake for anyone else's work. In her surprise theatrical hit Kedi about street cats in Istanbul, the Turkish-born director Ceyda Torun angled her camera from the cat's perspective.
There's absolutely no cats doing anything for our entertainment. It's on the contrary, the humans are doing things for our entertainment. And it was very important to me that I filmed the cats as if I was filming human subjects.
In Morgen's documentary about Jane Goodall, titled Jane, he combined 1960s archival footage with a new score by Philip Glass and a new interview with Goodall. Brett has applied different filmmaking styles in multiple works, from The Kid Stays in the Picture, when he pioneered photo animation, to his recent film about Kurt Cobain, Montage of Heck, that combines many techniques. Then there's Errol Morris, who has been a constant innovator. He even created his own interviewing device called the Interatron, so that subjects could look directly into the camera. You see the effect in films such as Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, and his Oscar-winning The Fog of War. Errol's experiments with style play out in different ways in his recent film The B-Side, about portrait photographer Elsa Dorfman, and in his new Netflix series Wormwood, that combines documentary interviews with dramatic scenes. When Errol began making films in the 1970s, the dominant style of documentary was observational, sometimes known as direct cinema. The philosophy was to let action unfold in front of the camera. Don't intervene and don't ask questions. Errol ignored this philosophy in his first film, The Gates of Heaven, about a pet cemetery. He constructed the film entirely with interviews.
There's a principle of law that with every benefit there's a burden, and the responsibility that you have with a dog, it's not just an inanimate object. In our life today, we do focus a lot of our attention on material things, such as automobiles, clothes, trips, and things of that sort, and even objects, paintings, and other kinds of things at home that you cherish. Well, an animal, I think, much more so you cherish because he does respond to you. He doesn't talk like a human being, but he's much more so than just an inanimate object. And I think that therefore a responsibility that a person has with an animal, you'll sense that when you have them, because their love and affection comes to you. And that love and affection over a period of years becomes a part of your life, and you just can't discard them.
I asked Errol what he was trying to do with the documentary form.
Fuck with it. I knew there were all of these documentary rules. I didn't come out of direct cinema. Not at all. I started watching films at the Pacific Film Archive, and the documentaries that I remember early on, there were Herzog's documentaries, and there was a documentary element really in all of Herzog's films. Agira is really a documentary of what happens if you take Klaus Kinski to the Amazon and put him in a conquistador suit and make a film about it. Properly considered, they're all documentaries. And I would see various films that really were contrary to what most people nowadays think of as documentary. Whether it was various French documentarians. I remember the Vigo film Apropos de Nice. Things that were somewhere between art films and something else, I'm not sure. And since documentaries cost, or at least they did in those days, so much less than regular movies, Roger Ebert asked me if I could define for him the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And I told him that's pretty easy, 2 zeros. Why not experiment with the form? So, style, the whole issue of style, or maybe I should let Brett speak because I've been babbling away here too long.
Well, in terms of choosing the style for the films, I always start from a very simple premise, which is how do you describe the subject? And if you can write down a list of adjectives or sometimes verbs or nouns to describe the subject, that then becomes the style of the film. And so the films become a reflection and they bounce back and forth. The way I got into this was similar to Errol, which was not through traditional documentary stuff. I love cinema. I couldn't speak until I was 5 years old. I had a terrible speech impediment and was in therapy until I was 16. But the movies were the most constant thing in my life. To this day, I can't even walk into a theater without getting popcorn. Like, I had to bring popcorn in there. So I just like movies. And then I got very lucky and almost spoiled in that when I was in a very young age, I got turned on to the French New Wave by a teacher at AFI named Jim Hosney. This is in like 7th grade. And when you're in 7th and 8th grade and you love cinema and you get exposed to the French New Wave, it's like mind-blowing because you suddenly realize film can be anything. And so I was going to try to become like a young French New Wave filmmaker, and I went to Hampshire College and I took a survey course on the history of documentary film, going from Lumiere and Flaherty up to Ross McAway and past Errol. And we had a very traditional professor named Len Glick. And I remember I saw this film, this short film called The Newer by, I believe, a ballerina / cinematographer named Hilary Harris, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a montage of this tribe in Africa. And it was asynchronous. And I remember thinking that I had such a better sense of who these people were through that montage than through any of the quote-unquote objective documentary approaches. And so that became a huge turn-on, which was this idea that you can use the language of cinema in the texture of it to tell your story. So then I just decided I was going to make nonfiction films and take everything I know that I loved about cinema and try to make nonfiction films for the cinema. But to me, there is a big definition between cinema and the other mediums, which is the sound and working the room and working. There's so much more available, I feel, working in theatrical nonfiction. I just want to say, I just have to say this, and I think I speak on behalf of all of us, that Errol, the thing that has amazed me about your career, and I think is the greatest source of inspiration of everything you've done, is that I've always felt that the thing you described, that each film you were challenging the existing notions of nonfiction to the point that you didn't settle on a style, that the difference between Gates of Heaven and Brief History of Time, and then when Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control came, it was like a complete another turn. And that sort of a sense of adventure, and I like to say that like most people can only dream of reinventing cinema, like if ever once. And like, I feel like in many ways you've reinvented the language several times, which it doesn't even exist. There is no counterpart in the realm of fiction. So
Gee whiz.
But no, I mean,
thank you.
When we talk about style and documentary, I mean, the conversation kind of begins with Errol, and it's sort of, I don't know where it goes from there. It's sort of. Anyways.
I remember thinking at the time I made my first film, Gates of Heaven, you had these documentary rules. The rule was that you should use available light. The camera should be handheld. It should not be on a tripod. You shouldn't move anything, God forbid. You should film things as they are, or such as they are, or how you imagine they are. And on. There were these documentary rules. And so I set about making a film that broke every single one of them. The character in Vernon, Florida, my second film, once said to me, "You know, Errol, you don't break the rules break you." And I've thought about that often over the years. I think he's right.
Ceyda, were you following rules in how you approach these cats?
No, not at all. But I was in the opposite end of the spectrum to you guys. I had nothing to prove. I mean, I had everything to prove, but also no name to defend. Nobody knew me. I had been only in narrative stuff and only as, short form or as producing. And so this was my opportunity to just throw everything out the window. And I find it interesting that you say there used to be rules. I feel like there's still all these rules about documentary formats and how you have to have certain amount of conflict in every scene. And, it can't possibly ever be a feel-good movie. It has to be these like sort of heavy, guidelines or more cerebral maybe rather than emotional and visual. And the only people who seem to be able to get away with it are people like yourselves who already have a name for them. So for me, it was like I just went into it thinking, we'll keep the budget as low as possible. We'll convince our investors that they'll never get their money back, and we'll just do what we can.
Oops, you failed.
We failed. Now they think they'll make money with every film that they invest in, which is scary.
That'll work for at least one more film.
Hopefully. But, it's so interesting. You're even making an animal the subject of a documentary. It's not a new concept by any means, but forcing a narrative onto the footage you're getting of those animals is what I tried to go against, because we already have sort of set beliefs about every other species on the planet, or even each other. So to be able to sort of throw everything out the window and change people's perception of another species, of another group of people, of another gender, of another religion, was all I could, attempt to do. And so I just tried to be as honest and authentic about it as possible. So I tried to have the perspective of my 8-year-old self when I used to follow these cats around, or my casual version that I talk to anybody and I get to know them and I want to know what their day is like. And so I wanted to just get to the bottom of that. And it was stylistically, it ended up requiring us to figure out how to be as close to the ground as possible without actually, breaking our backs or getting too dirty and getting weird attention from people. So my cinematographer and producing partner, Charlie, devised a camera, a rig that was basically, that allowed our cameras to be at ankle height. And he's like, he also comes from a narrative background, and his references are like the third man. So we're making a cat documentary in this novel with the third man as our reference for visuals. So that's why you get this film, I think, that you get.
Well, I'm very interested in the tools that filmmakers invent to tell their stories. Errol, one of your tools was the Interrotron. In fact, a friend of mine who used to work for your old law firm said when the law firm went out of business, they were getting rid of files, and he inherited the files of your paperwork applying for a patent for the Interrotron. Did you ever get that patent?
No. This is a cautionary tale for all of you out there who might seek a patent. Seriously. I had made a film about Stephen Hawking, Brief History of Time, and the New York Times had run an article about the movie called Interviewing the Universe. There was a 2-page spread of me interviewing people, and underneath that picture it said Errol Morris with his interviewing device, the Interrotron. So here's what all of you, see, I'm shaking my finger at you. You should remember, you have 1 year from the first public announcement of your invention until you can patent it. And during that year, you can patent it. After that, you're out of luck. And I didn't try to patent it until about a year after that article ran in the New York Times. So there you go.
Lessons taught.
I was fucked.
Brett, I want to ask about one of your most stylistically distinct films, The Kid Stays in the Picture, that you made with Nanette Burstein. That film, anyone who saw it at the time couldn't help but notice what you were doing with a photo animation technique, taking still photos, making them move and look like a 3D practice. Since then, that technique has been used in lots of other films, and it's interesting to reflect on techniques that start out new and then become commonplace. Can you talk about how your team, came upon that technique and got it into the film?
The Kid Stays in the Picture, talk about a movie that's about documentary film. That movie was entirely designed as that class I took in Hampshire College. My response to that was The Kid Stays in the Picture, opening up a movie with their three sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth, and no one is lying. And underneath that, you hear the sound of an orchestra tuning up. And there's red curtains, like you're in a theater, and the curtains open up, and you're in someone's backyard. So I'm trying to suggest that his whole reality is this artifice, right? And everything with Bob is about perception and illusion and what have you. And he's such a great storyteller. We weren't fact-checking anything, right? So the idea of distorting those pictures serve two purposes. One, on a surface level, it's about image and image making. And on a second level was distorting the image to create a covenant with the viewer that we're not necessarily entirely buying everything he's saying. It's a great yarn and we're going to go with it. And then, like I said, it's stylistically seducing you at the same time. So it's doing what Bob does, right? So again, everything stems from some sort of underlining reason. It's not style for style's sake, but style that serves a function that was in harmony with the narrative of the film, which was about a man who got everything in life because of his image. When that image became tarnished, had nothing left until he got his name back in Variety, and then he got everything back again.
Ceyda, getting back to the tools that you were creating to film with the cats, can you give us more detail about how you were getting down to cat level?
We had elaborate, by elaborate I mean at the hobby shops, the most elaborate remote-controlled pickup trucks we could find, and then we stripped them and outfitted them with the lighter, best kind of image-stabilized cameras that we could find, which was a brilliant idea, but in application, the cats absolutely hated it, and so we barely got to use it. And then we had tailor-made vests.
You might want to patent it.
This
could be the first time it's being made public.
No, the cat cam rig, yes, you're right.
Right
all
now.
Of this, all of this I have to patent.
The clock is ticking.
I got
November
it here.
10th.
You said the cats hated it.
Yeah, they hated the noise of the little engine, and they hated the little. It was just like a little inanimate thing running around. So they either attacked it or they ran away from it. Very rarely did they attempt anything else, but it was very clear early on that they only approved of the camera if we were attached to it, rather than if it was just like this thing of its own. And we tried to put vests on them with tiny cameras, which you can put the vests on them, but then they just sit there and they're like, I'm not moving. And then you realize halfway through that if they do move and disappear, that you're never getting the camera back. So it failed. And so in the end, the best way was that we were actually literally physically on the floor, or with this cat cam that we created, which allowed us to pull focus from the handle and still have the camera at ankle height. And then that way we could get all those tracking shots over the shoulder, tracking shots of the cats. And we were two cameras at all times. So, and it was like an elaborate dance that Charlie and I, our local Turkish cinematographer, would do, where one would pick the wide lens and one would pick the long lens in the morning, and then they would just kind of dance around each other trying to get the continuous shot.
I want to talk about music as a big part of the filmmaker's toolkit. Ceyda, how was your approach to music in Kedi?
I'm sick of seeing footage of Istanbul or Turkey accompanied by this like exotic kind of music, which doesn't mean anything. And
can you do another demonstration of that?
Please no. So I worked with a composer who was classically trained. She had no film scoring experience whatsoever, but she had been trained with Steve Reich and John Adams, and she had the sensibility of using, you know, percussion. And the whole score is basically mostly percussion. And it's the chimey sort of percussion actually ends up capturing that sort of timeless and feline feeling of cats. And then the rest of the music in the film is actually from Turkish musicians from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who were inspired by Western trends, and Western musicians who were inspired by Turkish music. So it kind of gives you this little, both it's a little nostalgic for like Turks who see it, because, you know, my film, like I didn't even think that we would be so successful in the US. Like I was making it for, the first audience were Turks, Istanbulites, and then Europeans, and then the U.S. and you know
humans, not
humans,
cats.
Cats, and you know obviously you hope it'll be a global thing and everybody in the world can see it. So you try to keep that in mind when you're crafting the film. But you know I had to add layers. I wanted to add layers of the film, and through music that was one of the ways I could do it. So if you're 40, 50, 60, 80, it doesn't matter if you're from Turkey, one of those pieces of music means something to you. And if you're not, they sound strangely familiar. You don't understand the lyrics, but you understand the melodies. So it kind of reinforces this idea that Istanbul is an accessible place, that has been a place where a lot of people have been through and settled, and it is really truly East meets West in that sense.
Errol, when you talked about throwing out the rules of cinema verite, one of those rules had been to not really use music in your film the way fiction filmmakers do, especially in Thin Blue Line and the score by Philip Glass. Music was front and center in that film. You've had relationships with a lot of different composers. Can you tell me what that conversation is like with a composer?
Well, it certainly depends on which composer. There's a line I like very much from Philip Glass. I'm always thinking about it. He said they can always copy what you've done, but they can never copy what you're going to do. I like that sentiment. The Thin Blue Line was the first movie where I'd actually used a lot of music. I don't know why that is. I'd made 2 films prior to that with hardly any music in them at all. And we were using scratch music. When you're editing, often you don't have a final score for a movie, so you'll dig up CDs, whatever, and put scratch music against picture to try to figure out what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And we were editing The Thin Blue Line with Philip Glass scratch music, a lot of it. And it works so well that I thought, oh, I'm going to have to get someone who can write music like Philip Glass. It took a long time to get him to agree to do it. It took a long time to get him to even look at a rough cut. When he looked at the rough cut, he immediately agreed to do it. And that was just the beginning of enormous difficulty. He wrote a lot of music that didn't quite work. I didn't know you were allowed to ask him to change the score. I shifted all the music around. Additional cues were written. I work with Philip at the piano on many of the cues. I remember telling him at one point, the trouble with this music, Philip, is it's just not repetitive enough. he gave me this odd look and said, "That's a new one." But I think that he created one of the best scores ever for a motion picture, and for that I am deeply grateful. So thank you, Philip.
I have to say, well, Brett is probably laughing extra hard because he just worked with Philip Glass on Jane. And Brett told me a story about that Philip Glass said about working with Errol. Brett, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. No, he told me that, he said that, that you reject almost everything. But he said he was secretly convinced that you do it so you can get a stash of temp tracks to use for other stuff.
Well, this is interesting. The only problem with this interpretation is that he owned all the music. And in fact, he was left with a stash of music which he could resell to others. He often told me how profitable it was for him to work on the Thin Blue Line because so much music had been created and he was able to use all of it.
I want to ask about stylistic choices that you make that when you do something deliberate in an interview, in the way you film a character, in a recreation, to get closer to the truth of a situation. Brett, in your film Jane, you're interviewing Jane Goodall, and one might think that you just happened upon her in her office and set up the camera and started interviewing. But there was a lot more intentionality behind that. Can you describe that?
Yeah. I had never done an interview for a documentary until Montage of Heck.
Your film about Kurt Cobain.
Film about Kurt Cobain, probably in some respects because I never thought of a good way to use interviews in a documentary, and feeling that everything has to have some sort of purpose. When I went to do Montage, we sort of designed all the locations, so nobody was at their house. We just sort of designed everything, which I think was heavily influenced by Brief History of Time, which I remember seeing the making of Brief History of Time and how you built sets for everything. And the beautiful aspect of that is now you can control the lighting, and now the lighting can be reflective of what the person is saying. Isn't that an amazing idea? I mean, talk about borrowing stuff from fiction. Why do we not light our interviews to reflect what someone's saying, or put the angle, the camera where it should be for that moment? But it seems to me that every decision one makes that we can, as directors, should be a reflection of what we're trying to convey. So with Jane, Jane didn't want to travel much from her house, so we went to her home in Dar es Salaam, and we found a room that was not being used, and we spent a week building it out to look like Gombe. And then what was intense was as we were rolling, her grandson came in and said, this was Hugo's room before he died. Hugo's Jane's husband. And he got very sick at the end of his life, and this was the room that he basically died in, and this was where we were doing the interview about him, which was quite interesting. But Jane loved how we designed it so much, she apparently kept everything exactly as is. But yeah.
Ceyda, now that you've made this film, Keddy, that's been so successful, what does it give you the appetite to do next?
I'm not taking anything for granted. I'm not assuming that anything else is going to be easy to do to get off the ground. So I'm just sort of starting from scratch. But yeah, so I actually have a narrative that was waiting in line, and another documentary that they both kind of overlap thematically in a certain way. So it's going to be very interesting. But right now it's a lot of fun to research both at the same time, but execute them in very different ways. But what gives me hope with the success of Kitty is, because we had a really rough road with Kitty. It was rejected from all the big festivals at first. We were not picked up by any sales agent. We never ended up having a sales agent. And it took showing at a festival where the general audience, cinema-going audience also attends. And as a result, there was such big response to it that we were able to get a U.S. distribution with Oscilloscope Labs, who saw the vision for the film and the potential for it theatrically, because it was providing an opportunity for people to get together in a cinema and celebrate something that they love. And, you know, I was unashamedly drawing people in with cats, but really, cats were the grape flavoring of the cough syrup. And hopefully, you know, like people coming out of it, or people in Alabama seeing the film and saying that they cared about this guy who was feeding these cats, and he's Muslim, and they never thought a Turk would, or a Muslim would be that nice to animals. I mean, that in itself was satisfying for me. But it gives you hope that you can try to do something differently, and it's a risk, but you know, it can pay off, and you just got to stick to your vision, I guess.
Errol Morris's new project, Wormwood, on Netflix, is a 6-part story investigating the death of CIA agent Frank Olson, who fell from the window of a Manhattan hotel in 1953. The CIA later said he jumped after an experiment with LSD gone wrong. But Olson's son Eric doesn't buy that theory. Eric thinks the CIA had a desire to get rid of Frank.
This is a bit like an Agatha Christie novel where you have so many possible motives, and the cumulative effect of it all was Frank is a liability because he's not on board with this, and we got to figure out a way of getting rid of him. Hey, we got an assassination manual that says you should drop him out of a window. Let's try that. I think that's kind of what happened here.
In addition to conducting interviews, Errol also creates scenes with actors speaking dialogue. Peter Sarsgaard plays Frank Olson. I asked Errol why he was drawn to using dramatic scenes.
We lack even an effective vocabulary to talk about this stuff. That's part of the problem. I see people straining to come up with some kind of terminology. Reenactment, a term which I despise. I had to deal with this at the time of the Thin Blue Line. The Academy refused even to consider the Thin Blue Line for an Oscar because it had reenactments in it. People who were there at the screening said they turned it off after 10 minutes, horrified. The Philip Glass music, the reenactments, you know, tell him to go fuck himself. And I got, of course, well, I'm defensive anyway, but I got even more defensive. And I would say, what exactly am I reenacting here? The reenactments in the Thin Blue Line were reenactments of untruth, of things that it was clear did not happen. What exactly is being reenacted anyway? And I would go around saying, after all, everything is a reenactment. Consciousness is a reenactment of reality inside of our pathetic little skulls. I might even stick with that. When you're trying to figure things out, you use everything at your disposal. Because what's the goal? And this is this endless confusion. I hear it, by the way, in various comments here in this festival. That documentarians are truth tellers. I would put it differently. The documentarians are in search of truth. They're looking for truth because truth matters in a true story. If there's something based on reality, you want to know whether it's true or false. After all, truth is about the relationship between language and images and the real world.
I don't know if you would describe all these techniques as helping in the search for truth. Do you think that the dramatic scenes where you've scripted dialogue in Wormwood, would you describe that as a tool in the search for truth?
Yes. The CIA put out a series of documents called the Colby documents. William Colby was the director of Central Intelligence at the time. And he put out this pile of papers. He was instructed to give them to the family by then President Gerald Ford. The Colby documents tell a story created by the CIA. Now, you tell me, was this story true? Was this story a cover-up? Or if it was a cover-up, what part of it was a cover-up? What part of it was true? And I became obsessed with the Colby documents. I still am. My obsessions never seem to end. They just go on and on and on. They'll kill me in the end. To me, it was really important to bring the Colby documents to life. I thought this much would be clear, but evidently it may not be. And in bringing those documents to life and the suspicions around them and the uncertainty of their veracity, you were bringing people deeper into the whole problem of the story of government lying in America, the nature of documents in general. Like any kind of expression in film, it's designed to make you think. And anything that makes you think, whether it's drama or reenactment or interview or archival material, we live in a time where people are really, really interested in repurposed media. But all of that is grist for the mill. It's not to say, oh, no, I don't like that. Does it serve the interests of the movie? Does it tell you something that otherwise you would not be able to grasp or understand? And my argument would be all of that style for the story is in service of the story.
With this archival footage and repurposing it and finding it, someone said to me, is your Jane film the definitive film on Jane? I said, absolutely not. The challenge became how to take something that talked about repurposing, something that was shot for a very different type of documentary, you know, a scientific 1963 documentary aesthetic, and appropriate that to create an immersive experience in 2017. But film is organic. This is why truth is so elusive, because whatever truth existed in 1963 is a different thing today. And so what I've seeked out and found in that footage is very much my narrative about what about now, not about 1963. And so I'm very acutely aware that when we're making films, they're very much a reflection of us and the time we're living in. If everyone in this room did a portrait of Benjamin Franklin right now, none of them are about Benjamin Franklin, they're about yourselves. Errol's movies are always about him. And I don't mean that in any way other than there's no way not to. As artists, our work is a reflection of us. And so the part of what I enjoy is you go on these journeys and we learn about ourselves through these other people. And the choosing the style and all that stuff is I think is part of the fun, the game, the jigsaw puzzle of what we do. But at the end of the day, I think ultimately they all become these kind of amazing growing experiences.
I want to thank Ceyda Torun, Brett Morgen, and Errol Morris for joining me at Doc NYC. Ceyda's film Ketty is now available on YouTube Red. Brett's film Jane is playing in theaters from National Geographic. Errol has several of his films on Netflix, including The Gates of Heaven, The Thin Blue Line, The B-Side, and his latest, Wormwood. Last year, I did another interview with Errol and Elsa Dorfman talking about The B-Side on episode 51. And you can hear my previous interview with Brett Morgen discussing his career on episode 58. If you're in New York City, I invite you to join us for our weekly screening series, Stranger Than Fiction, at the IFC Center. Each Tuesday, we show a documentary, followed by a conversation with the filmmaker or other special guest. The winter season of Stranger Than Fiction runs from February through March. Check purenonfiction.net for details. Thanks to the Pure Nonfiction team. Series producer, Sarah Moto. Sound mixer, Tom Micah. Web designer, Cross Strategy. And social media master, Jordan Smith. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. Pure Nonfiction is distributed by the TIFF Podcast Network. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.